deserve. You're going to get what you did.
With Gears 5 right around the corner, I decided to channel my excitement by replaying the entire franchise and give my impressions of each campaign. It's hard to believe it's been over 10 years since the original Gears, and with the recent Xbox One X enhanced versions of Gears 2 and 3, I figured now is a great time to hop back in and see where it all started. Without further ado, here's every Gears of War campaign ranked from worst to best.
External camera 15! Camera 10! Oh, damn it!
This is the game that probably surprised me the most while playing it again in 2019. Even with the remaster that released in 2015, the original Gears has not aged like I thought it would. The original Gears of War is still an iconic game. It's the game that not only started the franchise, but it's the game that sold a lot of people on the Xbox 360. To this day, a lot of people still remember the first gameplay trailer as well as the Mad World trailer that hit when it was releasing. Gears of War made an impact that won't be forgotten. That being said, the first Gears is more proof of concept and not great execution. From the cover system, D-pad weapon switching, active reload. But actually, hang on a second. Can we just talk about active reload for a moment? Am I the only one who thinks that active reload is one of the best game mechanics ever? And how have more games not implemented it? I know a few have, like Star Wars Battlefront, but as someone who plays a lot of shooters, I can't help but think it's a no-brainer as something to include. But I digress. As great as active reload is, the first Gears outing lacks variety. From the way the game looks, to the weapons, and the enemies, there just isn't a lot of change from the first act to the last. The first act is still strong, and ends with the first Berserker fight, which really gives players a good introduction to the world. The second act isn't as strong, but keeps things interesting with the Krill and Light mechanics that keep the gameplay interesting, but by the end of the second act, you've seen everything. The third act is where things really start to drag. The original Gears has a lot of weird tone shifts during the third act and almost feels like survival horror at times. While I know a lot of people love that tone, it doesn't mesh with the rest of the game or the franchise at this point. This is most evident in the level design where the Lambent Wretches appear, and there's a lot of really small areas where wretches fall down from different areas, and while that looks cool, gameplay wise it's pretty bland. The third act does end with the Corpser fight, which is pretty neat to see but isn't challenging in the slightest. The fourth act mostly takes place in the Phoenix household and again doesn't play to the strengths of the mechanics and includes a lot of small hallways and lackluster gameplay. The fifth act wraps things up with the train sequence and the ROM fight, which ultimately amounts you to just pumping bullets into ROM without any real strategy. It might sound like I'm just glossing over the entire campaign, and I basically am because there wasn't a ton to be excited about. This is due to the lack of any real story, and while you can't argue that the Gears franchise has always had an issue with its storytelling, the first Gears doesn't have anything too memorable the way the sequels do with stuff like Dom's wife, Ty, and even Adam Phoenix. There literally isn't much to say other than that the story focuses on the Lightmass bomb and stopping the Locust. But there's zero explanation to who the Locusts are, where they come from, what their goal is, or even why they're underground. Your goal is to activate the Resonator to map the tunnels, which ultimately fails, find the data you need for the tunnels, which Adam Phoenix has lying around apparently, then activate the Lightmass bomb, which succeeds. Done. It works to move the story along, but that's all it does. The character development is pretty shallow, and while we do get a bit of expose on Marcus and why he's in prison when the game started, it doesn't translate into anything meaningful till the third game, which touches on the subject again. The gameplay is where the original Gears still feels decent, but also hasn't aged as well as I thought. The gameplay suffers in one key area, and that's enemy variety. Most fights are against drones and the occasional boomer and eventually some Theron guards, but none of them force you to change how you play the game. One thing I never remembered was the crazy accuracy of the enemies. Drones do not miss their targets and can drain your health super quick. Boomers can snipe you from a mile away with a boom shot, and while playing the game on hardcore and insane, it makes every fight feel super long and drawn out. I actually enjoyed playing on normal rather than something more difficult just because it kept the game moving. The cover system that Gears made popular also doesn't feel nearly as smooth as I remembered either. The number of times I got stuck trying to get in and out of cover was insane. Going from cover to cover works better in the remake than the original, but even the remaster was filled with many occasions of me just wrestling with the cover system trying to get into the position that I wanted, and instead letting me to get killed due to the crazy good accuracy of the Locust. Overall, once I bumped the difficulty down, I had a much better time with the original Gears. And while Rom is still a complete badass, he is one note and ultimately his death, in the end, ended with me in a sigh of relief that it was over and I could move on to the next game. But we need to talk about the presentation, which again is a mixed bag. Again, even with the benefit of the remaster, which does help considerably, the original Gears is so full of brown and black areas it just starts to feel boring from an art perspective. There isn't much to say on that front, and all the other games using that older UE3 engine had a very similar look to it. And that's all there really is to say about the original Gears. While it will always be iconic for what it started, the final product is very one-note and doesn't have a lot of story or mechanics to dive deep into. Even with the benefit of the remaster, the original Gears serves more as a proof of concept of what the franchise can be, and the sequels prove that the franchise can achieve greatness. But ultimately, it earns the spot of number 5 on my list.
Cut off the head of the snake, and the body dies.
It might be surprising, but I really did have a better time with Gears of War Judgment than the original Gears. Gears Judgment has always been kind of the odd one out of the series, but going back and replaying it in 2019 kind of put that into focus. While I think it's better than the first in some ways, it was a pretty close call. The thing about Judgment is that it's not a bad game in the slightest. In fact, I would say it's a game that's still worth playing, but Judgment doesn't really feel like a Gears game at times. By that I mean the core mechanics and overall feel of the gameplay are tweaked in a way that can be jarring for a lot of hardcore Gears fans, but it never goes far enough to feel like a completely different game. After picking up the controller, things are immediately different. The speed of everything has been ramped up, including how fast you switch weapons, which is now almost instant, to how often the Locust will try and move in versus staying in cover, and even how fast damage recovery is. Everything has been increased and is significantly faster than any other Gears game. What this does is create a game that forces you out of cover a lot more and plays more like an in-your-face third-person shooter and not a cover-based one. Other things have been tweaked like controls. The biggest thing that threw me off was having only 2 weapons and the button to switch weapons being the Y instead of being mapped on the D-pad, as well as having grenades available at all times and not having it being switched to a separate weapon. It might not seem like a huge change, but it took a significant amount of time to rewire my brain to the change, and by that time the game was over. Enemies in Judgment are also way more aggressive than others. The Locusts absolutely love to run up and start blasting with their shotguns in your face or rev up their chainsaws and mindlessly run at you. When you combine that with the overall speed increase and an abundance of maulers and blood mounts, Judgment is a game where you're constantly on your toes. This might not seem like a bad thing, but it just doesn't feel like a Gears game at some points. Yes, the Lancer still rocks and the Gnasher will be your go-to weapon to get in the face of the Locust, but instead of feeling like you were planning out your attacks, you're always on the defense. But all that being said, I still had a lot of fun while playing Judgment, and that's because it has the things that the first game lacks, like enemy variety, larger spaces to have more dynamic encounters, and yes, even this version of UE3 has some color in it. But I think what kept me interested was the way the campaign plays out. The story is broken into a lot of smaller subsections, with each area presenting a challenge rather than just moving from point A to B. But each section also basically has an optional modifier. This can range to having to only use certain weapons in an area or having your vision impaired due to an environmental hazard. While some of these are not fun, like most of the time-based ones which force you to get to a certain point before a timer expires or you simply die, most of them offer a unique way to play each section which keeps things interesting. I will say without these modifiers, the challenge of the game is significantly less. I played a couple areas without the modifiers simply to see what it's like, and I had a much better time with them on. The annoying thing is at the end of each section it sort of gives you a star rating, and the goal being that you want to get all the stars. But I don't really find that this adds anything to it. I kind of just wish I could put the modifiers on as more of a harder difficulty and just play through the game. But let's move on to the story, or lack thereof. Judgment is a prequel and follows Kilo Squad, who is on trial for actions deemed illegal by Colonel Ezra Loomis. I would go into detail, but it doesn't have much depth. The basics are there, and a big bad Locust named Karn is threatening to destroy everything, and Kilo Squad decides to defy orders to not use the light mass missile to destroy him. The story does feel like an afterthought, and while it features fan favorites like Baird and Coltrane, it has no real long-term effects on the franchise, which is a bummer. Bottom line, the story is pretty forgettable, which is a shame considering all of the deep lore that the franchise does have, and especially at this point being a game that came out after the third one, there were many different avenues they could have went, but they decided not to. So Gears of War Judgment ends up being a weird experiment in the franchise, and while some ideas were good, the majority of the changes overall to the mechanics create a different type of game. And while it's still fun, it misses the mark of being a great game. I still enjoyed it more than the original, like I said, and it really is because of the graphics being considerably better and the gameplay being more fun due to the increase in enemy variety. But it was a close call, and Gears of War Judgment does sit solidly at my list at number 4.
Pardon me, Lieutenant Baird.
It's Private Baird now. Loomis just demoted me.
My congratulations.
Couldn't have done it without you.
I think that means I might be in charge.
Perfect.
Whoa!
Oscar, hurry! We gotta beat that wall! We're almost there!
The Coalition's first attempt at Gears wasn't the strongest debut fans probably would have liked, but replaying it recently cemented this game in the 3rd position for me. Gears 4 has a lot going for it. The gameplay is the best in the series by far. The gunplay feels faster than previous games, but it doesn't feel weird like the spin-off Judgment did. While the story isn't the highlight of the game, it does feel like it's being taken more seriously and has a plan set in place unlike the first game. The presentation is top-notch with fantastic animation and audio. Everything about Gears 4 is set in place for it to be a home run, but it doesn't quite get there. But first let's talk about how it plays. The cover system feels near perfect. While by the time Gears 3 came around, the cover system felt much smoother with a lot less of the awkward jank that would crop up from time to time, but somehow the Coalition made it feel even smoother. Transitions from cover to cover feel fluid, and the ability to now yank enemies from cover is a much welcomed addition that gives yet another way to tackle enemies and environments. And man, Gears of War 4 is gorgeous. The Gears franchise has always been one that pushes the current boundaries of consoles, but something about Gears 4 just pops. The varying environments always look insanely detailed, and the addition of the windstorm show off the tech in a really neat way. Characters and animations look insanely slick, and have a huge step up over the previous generation of Gears. And if you have an Xbox One X, it's easily one of the best titles to show off the 4K visuals. Simply put, the presentation and gameplay are the best the series has ever been, but when you start playing through the story is when things start to go a little sideways. Playing through the campaign is where things start to feel a little off, and while I still really enjoyed replaying Gears 4, it feels like a first attempt again, similar to how the first Gears felt. With Marcus not being the main character anymore, the Coalition had a lot of work to do to make JD Phoenix and Kate the new faces of Gears, and unfortunately, they don't get there. To say the Gears franchise has a deep story would be disingenuous, and you could honestly say it's the weakest part of the franchise. But the way Gears 4 was being sold, it was being set up to make it feel like it was going to be a different generation with this new set of Gears. But the first 2 acts of Gears 4 are not nearly as strong as the rest of the story, and it's mainly due to the lack of character development and the addition of a new enemy called DBs. The DBs are basically what you don't want in a Gears game. Slow, dumb enemies that aren't a challenge. And while their entrance is always cool to see with their pods just dropping out of the sky and onto the battlefield, they stick around way too long, and feel like they were supposed to be sort of a tutorial enemy to get people used to the mechanics of Gears. Eventually they do take a backseat to the new threat, the Swarm, which in all honesty is a new evolution of the Locust, with a new, more lethal version of the enemies you're used to. From the new Pouncers to the Scion, the Swarm feels like the real threat when they show up in Gears 4. And the story starts to pick up and feel more like an evolution of Gears from the previous generation to the next. Once Gears 4 gets there in terms of gameplay, everything clicks. From the gorgeous visuals to the smooth gameplay, the campaign eventually hits a high mark that gives a lot of promise to the franchise moving forward. But just when things are starting to get good, Gears 4 just sort of ends, and that's what holds it back from being truly great. The story ends on a cliffhanger that sort of comes out of nowhere, and while it gives Gears 5 a place to go story-wise, it makes Gears 4 feel like a slow introduction with not a lot of payoff. Gears 4 should have been better, but with this being the Coalition's first attempt at bringing Gears back and for a new audience, it still gets enough right to be called a good game. And I still enjoyed playing it again for the second time. But just like the next game we're going to talk about, sometimes you have to lay the groundwork for the sequel, and that's what Gears 4 does. Let's just hope the Coalition's second attempt is as good as Epic's was with Gears of War 2.
It was my grandmother's. I never knew her.
It's beautiful.
Incoming! Goddamn locust. It never ends.
Bigger, better, and more badass. Those were words that Cliffy B used to describe Gears 2, and while most marketing ends up being fluff, for once the tagline was 100% correct. Gears 2 from the ground up is a complete leap over the original. The gameplay and cover system have been vastly improved, the story actually has some depth and meaning and feels like it's building towards something, and the drab, colorless environments have been updated to create a much more appealing game to look at. But the biggest improvements stem from the pacing of the story with the combination of new gameplay styles and enemy variety. Replaying the Gears games made me just appreciate how much enemy variety there is in the franchise. The design of Gears is very unique in that while most shooters have you pushing forward, Gears is a lot about reacting to what's on screen and deciding how to tackle each scenario. Gears 2 is really where that design philosophy and design comes to the forefront. Gears 2 has much better story pacing and keeps every act interesting by varying up the gameplay with vehicle segments combined with varying locations and tactics. Each act has a very distinct rise and fall, and takes place in a fairly unique location. From the first act taking place in buildings and on the back of vehicles, from being inside the worm to making your way through the Locust underworld, all the way to the end with you riding a Brumac wasting Locust everywhere you go, the campaign never has a dull moment. And even though Scourge made an awesome introduction but ultimately falls flat by the end, it still has an arc that rises and falls in a satisfying way. Gears of War 2 starts to build on the characters in the way the first game did not. You learn more about every character, but it's fair to say that Marcus and Dom have always been at the forefront, and while there were hints of Dom being lost without his wife in the first game, that narrative is at the forefront for the sequel. It's the first time you see the real relationship between Marcus and Dom and the camaraderie that has been built by the war at hand. Your introduction of a few side characters like Ty also helped drive that narrative home, and takes it in the right direction to show just what kind of effects the war has on these characters. Ty's death in particular messes with Marcus as he sees something he knew as an unbreakable soldier commit suicide right in front of his eyes. And that brings us to that scene in Gears of War 2. Dom's major arc amounts to the scene where he finally finds his wife, Maria. It's presented in a way where Dom can finally have relief for finding his wife, but then he very quickly realizes that, like Ty, Maria has been completely broken down by the Locust, basically being a vessel and not even the person that he knows. This scene is very divisive. Some think it's ridiculously overacted and comes off as kinda hokey, and while I can agree that the acting isn't exactly strong, I never have and still don't find this scene bad. If anything, I think looking at it over a decade later with fresh eyes and not having the mind of a teenager, hits even harder than it did before. I wasn't grabbing the tissues or anything, but I felt bad for Dom. And when the camera cuts away to Marcus telling him it's gonna be okay and then walking away and only stopping when he hears the gunshot is presented in a way that's gripping. It shows Marcus in a light of where he just knows he has to get everything done so that way something like this in the future doesn't happen, so that other people that he knows and cares about can have a tomorrow. Personally, I really liked it, and I think it did kind of bring the franchise forward in being able to tell a story that people do care about. It's a scene when combined with the death of Ty sets the tone for the rest of the trilogy, and in the end helps bring the game full circle at the end of the third game. And while the game is still about dudes killing Locust, I still think there is a good story to be told, and this scene is a good example of that. Overall, the story of Gears 2 is a huge step up, and actually started to make myself and others care about the Gears. And I think it serves as a good way to set up the third game and makes the final scene in Gears 3 better for it. But let's move on to the story and talk more about the presentation, which is probably the only area that I commend, but also am a little disappointed with Gears 2. While the color palette is something that is improved in the sequel, there are a few times where the game is still a little bit drab. It's nowhere near as drab as the original, but when you compare it to the subsequent games, it lacks something that the sequels have, like the color green. That may seem like an odd thing to harp on, but things like color are missing from Gears and Gears 2. Gears 2 adds some different palettes to the mix, but things still don't just pop the way you think they should, or probably how you remember that they do. But there are a ton of moments where you just want to stop and look at the distant details and spectacle, something you never wanted to do with the original Gears. The vastness of the Locust home and the underworld is much more realized. The buildings and structures underground are insanely detailed, and it does feel like you are in the Locust home territory, which again really helps drive home some of that narrative. Overall, the presentation feels much more interwoven into the game's story, and that's evident from the beginning to the end.
All that you held.
So yes, Gears 2 is bigger, better and more badass. It is better than its predecessor in every facet and serves as a fantastic sequel that shows off what the Gears franchise could be. I, like many others, became fans for life after this game, and it is definitely worth replaying to this day.
Of this, I have no doubt. But life continues on, with or without you. One can only hope that one leaves behind a lasting legacy. But so often, the legacies that we leave behind are not the ones that we intended.
Where's Carmine?
That thing can't take a hit.
I must confess, going into this experiment to replay the series, I was looking forward to Gears 3 the most. But after finishing Gears 2 and only having what I remembered of Gears 3, I started to think that Gears 2 might take the crown from Gears 3 as being the best. Gears 2 left an impression that was much higher than I remembered, but Gears 3 still left a stronger impression. Gears 3 is truly the culmination of the series, and while it still has a few issues I'm not fond of, by the time the credits rolled, the journey to get to the end just very slightly edged out Gears 2. Gears 3 wins because of the gameplay, and while I still think Gears 4 plays the best out of any of the games, Gears 3 is by far the most fun. This is again due to the enemy variety, which has been ramped up even further with the introduction of the Lambent, as well as new locusts for Marcus and his crew to tackle. The Lambent is everything that the DBs from Gears 4 are not, and Epic did a much better job of introducing a new enemy to the Gears franchise. They don't act vastly different from the Locust for the most part, which makes sense since the Lambent are just the Locust evolved from the Emulsion. But the biggest factor for me was that the Lambent do not overstay their welcome, whereas the DB should have been replaced by the Swarm much sooner. The Locusts eventually do make their way back into being the main focus, and while the Lambent do pop up from time to time, they never feel like a drag to fight. The amount of enemy variety in Gears 3 is very high. Not only are there new Lambent, but new Locusts as well, which creates even more scenarios for the player to tackle. The area design is key to this point, as Gears 3 has the most dynamic level design of the series, and features a ton of variety in its area design. Each section changes quite a bit, with cover strategically being placed in various ways as you travel from each area. And somehow, through the entirety, things never felt like they were being repeated directly. A major factor in this is to the way now that the Locusts appear. I'm not sure if I'm the only one who feels this way, but the way the Locusts just come flying out of the ground never gets old. Seriously, it's such a cool looking effect and beats the traditional emergence hole you are used to at this point. Everything from the sound effects to the animation is just like an awesome superhero intro coming from the surface and landing with a purpose. But it's important because there are times when this happens when action is getting increasingly tense, and just when you think things are settling down, you're greeted with the Locust rocketing to the surface with him and 4 of his friends. It creates a dynamic not felt in any of the other Gears titles, and it's something I forgot about but truly appreciated this time around. Speaking of appreciation, the gunplay feels just right, and this combined with the new dynamics of each area keep the entire campaign feeling epic and just fun to experience. It's the only Gears game that I went back and tried on a harder difficulty during my playthrough, because I just wanted to see how it changed with the tougher enemy. And I think it's the only game in the series to benefit by making the enemy hit harder, but also act smarter by increasing the difficulty. The gameplay is what makes Gears 3 click better than any of the others, and when you combine the stellar presentation, you have the most polished campaign in the franchise. But let's talk about the presentation now, because this is the one area where Gears 3 simply shines. Even though I am now able to see Gears 3 through a different lens due to Xbox One X support, I remember being incredibly impressed at the time when it came out. The UE3 engine by this point had hit its stride. Yes, some of the textures look crazy low now, and the quality sticks out more due to the higher resolution now being used. But this is only present during cutscenes, and the rest of the time Gears 3 looks stunning. The amount of different locations is increased, and there isn't a single time where I felt like I was looking at something boring and drab. That complaint of lack of variation, location, and color is completely absent from Gears 3, making it hands down the best presentation overall. But we do have to talk about the story, which is where I go back and forth on Gears 3 and Gears 2. Gears 3 starts more promising than any other game in the franchise. With the introduction of Adam Phoenix being alive and the Locust Queen Mira finally being the main protagonist, as a player, I was excited and ready to see how the series would wrap up. But unfortunately, it doesn't quite get there. The overall story arc rests on finding Adam Phoenix and getting the answers we've been waiting for. And those answers amount to Adam Phoenix basically saying, "We always run out of time." It turns out that Adam Phoenix knew the Locusts were coming, and when he attempted to help them fight off the Emulsion, when he failed, Queen Mira had decided to invade. But that's really the only context we get after 3 games. We never get a real look into Mira as well as where she came from. With the hints of her origin coming in Gears 5, we may finally get those answers, but a lot of people, including myself, expected a lot more. But before we talk about the rest of the end, we have to talk about, again, that scene. And that scene being Dom's death. Gears 3 had a lot of hype leading up to it, with its Brothers to the End tagline, and while that isn't exactly the focus of everyone's story, it is the focus of Dom's arc in Gears 3. Dom still hasn't found peace after the death of his wife in Gears 2, and he feels that he can't join her until he's done helping Marcus save the world. At this point, looking at the arc with fresh eyes, I have to mimic what I said earlier in that I feel for Dom more than I did almost 10 years ago now after playing Gears 3 for the first time. But I will say I didn't find his death any more impactful, and I may have to agree with some that it wasn't needed to fulfill his story. Ultimately, Dom decides to sacrifice himself to help Marcus and the rest of the Gears get away as they were being overrun by Lambent. The reason I don't think it hits home for me, and probably many others, is that the situation they were in didn't seem that dire compared to the countless others, and Dom's death doesn't feel like it came organically, but instead was added as a way to try to make the player feel something. Dom just deserved better, honestly. It seems like Epic has trouble getting to the conclusion that they want, and while their scenes always are well shot and impactful, the writing behind them I think makes them fall flat for some. But I still think the final cutscenes paint a picture that is satisfying in wrapping up the characters and the story. The scene of Adam Phoenix crumbling in front of Marcus and his dog tags falling into Marcus's hands is visually very impactful, as well as the final confrontation with Mira and Marcus stabbing her saying it's for Dom and everyone she killed. Even though we didn't get the answers we wanted, we still got resolution in the war. And you can see it in Marcus's face at the very end when he throws his Lancer to the side, takes off his armor, and removes his bandana. You see what this war has caused him to lose, and while it's finally over, it shows ultimately what Gears have to go through and sacrifice for the ability to say there is a tomorrow. While I think the Gears 2 story is a bit stronger in its delivery, the overall conclusion in Gears 3 is more satisfying. And when you combine all of that with everything else, like the superb gameplay and presentation, and with the fact that Gears 3 is just so damn fun and epic, you have the best Gears campaign. And with that, it's time to end this video. Let me know what you think about the Gears campaigns in the comments below. Let me know if you agree with me and if you think Gears 3 is the best, or maybe you like Gears 2 more. I'm also really interested in what Gears fans think about Gears of War Judgment, as it's being sort of a outlier and a prequel. A lot of people don't like it, but I'd be curious to see how people feel about it now. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps us out, and we'll see you next time.